Dun dun da da dun dun da da dun dun da da dun dun da dun 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 da da dun dun da da dun dun da da dun dun da da dun da da dun dun da da dun dun da da dun 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 da da dun dun da da dun 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 da da dun dun da da dun dun da da dun 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 da da dun.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the For the Record podcast. I'm joined yet again by my good friend Luke J. Williams to discuss the first 2 seasons of Game of Thrones.
So
So Game of Thrones is one of the most popular television shows of all time. Everybody has heard of Game of Thrones. It smashed ratings records and became the most significant series in pop culture, so much so that it was all anybody was talking about for a majority of its airtime in the 2010s. Now the series can be very distinctly split up into 4 quarters, and for this episode of the podcast, we will be talking about the first 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, saving the other seasons for future episodes. So Luke, let's start off with how we watched Game of Thrones. So you've actually recently rewatched the entire series, haven't you?
yeah, so I watched it originally when it was airing, from season 3 onwards, like every episode weekly.
When did you start watching it? When did you jump on the Game of Thrones hype train? Do you remember?
Yeah, in high school, like 2013 or 2012, like a friend had given me seasons 1 and 2, like on a hard drive, as you did in high school, and you watched all of it in like a week. And then season 3 came out, and I was watching that week to week, and I was watching it week to week from then on. You kind of had to, you know, like if you weren't watching Game of Thrones, you were missing out on half the social interactions of the time, you know?
That's true.
Yeah.
Was there any key differences between watching it for the first time way back then and rewatching it late last year?
Yeah, of course. Watching it when it comes out, you like feel like you're in this hype kind of train, and everyone's talking about the good things that happen. You go in the next day, and everyone's like, yeah, this happened, and this happened, and you're like, yeah, that was so cool, and that happened. Barely anyone had any bad things to say. Then when you watch it all at once in quick succession, it's a bit different. You miss some parts, you muddle it, but you get to see what's worse about it in certain areas and the mistakes that are made, because it's kind of more glaring right in your face.
I think too, having the bigger picture, knowing like who all the characters are, because I remember watching Game of Thrones for the first time, particularly in the first 2 seasons. It's one of the most difficult shows to watch ever, simply because there are so many characters, and they're not characters that like have really easy names to remember either. It's in a fantasy setting, and they throw so many characters at you. Like in the pilot alone, I think they introduce like 15 main characters, and then a couple of episodes later, when they get to King's Landing, we get hit with like another 5 to 10, and the show kind of continues that like throughout its entire runtime. So it's quite difficult wrapping your head around watching it for the first time. So it's quite interesting, like being able to go back, knowing who everyone is, and then getting to see like knowing where they end up as well, getting to see like a lot of the seeds that get planted in especially those first 2 seasons, which we'll be discussing today.
You definitely pick up on more stuff from certain characters and bits that end up, and you're like, oh, they're setting up for that. And of course, being one of the first like main big ensemble shows, it was really difficult to follow back then. But when you watch it week to week, I feel like it's a little bit easier to kind of like contain yourself, not knowing where it's going to go, trying to guess and stuff, and just having that episode to like to judge, basically.
I think I watched it when season 4 had just finished. I think that's when I started. For about a good year, I had my friends at high school really bugging me to watch it, and I was kind of like, oh, I'm not too sure, you know, on the fence a little bit. Then I eventually went down the rabbit hole and started my piracy career and watched the first few seasons of Game of Thrones. I actually watched the entire series with my dad, which might not have been the smartest decision, especially
I watched that shit alone.
Yeah, so did I later. But yeah, it might not have been the smartest decision watching the early seasons in particular with a parent. But from really season 1, I was hooked. Like,
why were you on the fence about it? Why did you not want to watch it?
I generally, well, at that time, like I hadn't really seen too many TV shows. I was only like 15, I think. So I was pretty young. And like I was keen, but I didn't really know much about it. I knew people were talking about it, but I hadn't been exposed to the show yet, because it's like, it's an R18 show and I'm only 15, right? I'm a little younger than you, so didn't really know what it was about, and then went down the rabbit hole. And I would say, like, season 1 I thought was just solid. Like, I knew I liked it and I was into it, but I think it took me a little longer for it to really hit and be like, this is fucking incredible. Like, this is something special.
Well, I think we miss certain parts of it when we're younger as well. 14, 15-year-olds watching it, we're not able to pick up on how well it's crafted, especially in the earlier seasons.
Yeah.
You just kind of see it, you're like, this is the tits and sword show. It's got dragons in it and stuff. And you watch it because it's popular, but there's something about it that you like and you kind of recognize in that, like, early stage. But it's not until you watch it again as you're older with a bit more knowledge about certain things that you can pick up how well it's crafted, especially those first 2 seasons.
For sure. I think what makes Game of Thrones so special, I can't think of another TV show that's had a bigger impact on pop culture.
True.
I think it's just insane impact. Like, maybe not so much with seasons 1 and 2. I think it was probably season 3, season 4, around the time I actually started watching, which was when Game of Thrones really started to take off and be that flagship show for HBO and that #1 TV show in the world. But right through, like, there just haven't been other shows like it. I remember watching the later seasons. I was watching 3 different podcasts after each episode. I would watch the episode and then watch 3 different podcasts discussing the episode. Such was, like, the fanfare and like, interest around talking about the show. I remember all of the different discourse at the end of each season, like, oh, what's going to happen next season? What's going to happen to this character? Comparing it to the books, saying, well, in the books this happens. Is that going to happen in the TV show? And there was just so much talk around the show, really right from the get-go. And it's quite interesting because it is an adaptation of a series, and it makes a number of changes from the books, but also keeps a lot of the things the same, and it's really interesting to have, like, such a big discourse. I don't think anyone's talked about a television show more than Game of Thrones has been talked about.
Look, it's one of those ones that, like, the 2010s kind of popular TV shows are their own kind of animal. It was social media rising up and starting to, like, be able to market and stuff like that.
It's a changing landscape for television.
Yeah, like, think about The Walking Dead as well. Like, that and Game of Thrones were both kind of coming up at the same time. They were really big and popular and brought up more by social media as well. But Game of Thrones, specifically the first 2 seasons, were a little bit kind of under the radar as far as I remember. Like, people were talking about it. Like you said, season 3 it started to skyrocket, bigger budget. There was fucking trailers for every single episode. There was the after episode, like, talk shows that they did with actual actors and writers and cast and crew and shit like that aired right after the episode on HBO. Which I never bothered watching because I'm not going to pirate a talk show episode. But yeah, they did the same thing with The Walking Dead, and then you get all the clips and trailers and posters and season trailers that became massively popular online when it was airing. So it was this insane phenomenon that took over. And like you said as well, the popular culture impact. I remember going to Supernova. That's right, I went to Supernova when I was younger. You'd see people dressed up as fucking Game of Thrones characters. I saw George R.R. Martin running around once. God. He got popular from this.
Well, he could have been there because he certainly wasn't writing the book.
He was doing everything but writing books. But yeah, it had a crazy impact on pop culture. Like, a lot of things have, like Star Trek, like Trekkies and shit like that.
Yep.
Game of Thrones was its own thing. It was more accessible. You had regular people watching it instead of just like nerds,
exactly.
People who specifically wanted to watch fantasy stuff. You have everyone who's everyone talking and watching about Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and I think for me too, personally, I've always enjoyed the discussion around certain movies or TV shows, arguably more than the show itself, depending on the kind of thing. Like, for example, Star Wars. I really enjoy talking about Star Wars, watching videos or analysis on Star Wars more than the films themselves, actually, especially with, like, the case of, like, the prequels and the sequels. And Game of Thrones really fits into that as well. Like, the discussion around the seasons, the episodes, the events, what was kind of unfolding at the time, that was, for me, like, just as enjoyable as watching the television show itself. Honestly, like, I don't think there's been a television show that's, like, been talked about more. There's so many YouTube channels blossomed in the Game of Thrones sphere.
We've both consumed a lot of Game of Thrones content. I've seen a lot of stuff, deep dives, what went wrong later on. It's good content. It's good to watch that kind of stuff, and that's also is a part of how the show came up. Social media rising, more YouTubers started to make those video essays specifically about seasons. You could talk about so many things because so much shit happened in every season of Game of Thrones, and it was its own kind of like world.
And the fan theories as well, like that was one of my favorite
what
aspects.
Was going to happen,
exactly.
Based on stuff from the books as well. Yeah.
It's really, really fun. It's important too to like recognize just how much Game of Thrones changed the television landscape. So in the early 2000s, you had that first like television renaissance with HBO and like The Sopranos and Oz, The Wire, and then there was another one with kind of beginning with Breaking Bad in the late 2000s, and then Game of Thrones kind of hopped on in like the middle of that and really fucking pushed it forward even further. Like it changed television forever.
When was the first season of Game of Thrones? Was it 2009?
2010 or 11. I'm pretty sure it's 10, but it might be 11. But budgets for Game of Thrones in the later seasons were ridiculous. They were feature film length. And
well, the episodes were almost feature films.
Yeah, exactly.
Hour and a half episodes instead of like a series of 10 like they were doing originally.
And we've seen that too with other TV shows. Like TV shows are getting incredibly high budgets now, and they're only getting more and more expensive because like production companies and stuff are really seeing the potential that television has to be monetized. And I think Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, mind you, really pioneered that, especially with their early seasons. Like Game of Thrones in the early seasons didn't have the biggest budget, but it was still vastly bigger than like anything else we'd seen before. And not just in terms of budget, but scope. Like it was basically like an Avatar film, right, for TV.
A high concept fantasy.
Exactly.
Like medieval fantasy, not easy to do.
And when it comes to budgeting, like the big key things you want to avoid if you want to keep a low budget, you don't want VFX. Game of Thrones has dragons, it has direwolves, it has whole settings and landscapes that require VFX. You don't want a large cast. Game of Thrones cost half of the UK in their production. You don't want lots of locations. Game of Thrones has more locations than any other TV show ever made. Like maybe Star Trek or something, but absolutely insane. Like the scope of it was incredible, and really you gotta take your hat off to HBO for backing a show like this, because look, if I had read the books and I was a producer, I would be very hyped about the potential for it, but realistically, like it's a huge undertaking to try and tackle like that.
You'd be
set
asking
of novels.
if it could be done. Not just that, but production design level as well. Every single person needs a tailored costume to fit into that time. You've got props, you've got carts and horses and armor and swords and so much shit, the banners and everything they need, plus dressing those sets in those locations.
The number of battle sequences as well, because you have to remember there was quite a few books.
Less earlier on though.
Yeah. That's true, but they were tackling the entirety of what had came out at that point, and knowing what we know now and what actually happens, there was so much to tackle. And then you have the issue of like aging actors and making sure that you can keep them around for 5+ years. Ended up being 9 years with 8 seasons, and arguably could have been a lot longer as well. Like it was such a incredible undertaking.
They did not succeed with all of those actors.
They didn't pull it off in the end, spoilers, but particularly early on, like they really laid the groundwork for this show to succeed. And I think without particularly seasons 1 and 2 being so incredibly solid, they wouldn't have earned those higher budgets, and Game of Thrones wouldn't have become what it ended up becoming.
They proved that they could do it with a lower budget, totally changed what they could do for future seasons, and it was a mistake. They should have just kept doing what they could do with the lower budget. It would have been better.
That's true. What I find most interesting about Game of Thrones is it's a high concept fantasy show based off novels that were popular, but they weren't like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series or anything too crazy like that, right?
I hadn't heard about them before the series.
Neither had I. It's an R-rated show or whatever. Like it's a highly rated adult only kind of series. There's a lot of violence, a lot of gratuity, a lot of nudity. It's almost pornographic. The reputation Game of Thrones actually had for the first few seasons was it was basically porn with some sword fighting, right?
True.
Which wasn't true, but that was its reputation. And it was, a high budget show compared to a lot of other TV shows. So it's kind of set up to be like, this isn't something that's going to appeal to a mainstream audience at all. Like, fantasy is very much like, I know my parents are like, oh, we don't like fantasy. It's very much like appealing to a certain audience in that regard. Yet somehow it just became a perfect storm. All of these things came together, despite the nudity, despite the violence, despite it being a fantasy show, despite it being a really complicated and political drama. It somehow managed to all work out and become the most popular show on television.
For everyone. Yeah, everyone was fucking watching it. You know, you couldn't not watch Game of Thrones. Some people still haven't seen it, and they're wrong.
Losers.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe they were right. Maybe they were right in the long run. But yeah, let's move on, because I really want to talk about the pilot, because for me, the pilot is such an interesting episode, because I remember watching it the first time. Winter is Coming is the episode title. I remember watching it for the first time and just being like, what the fuck is going on? There's so much thrown at you in 60 minutes of runtime. It's really, really rough. Looking back at the pilot, I have seen it a couple of times since. It is so fucking good. It's
good. No, it is, genuinely. It's such a good setup.
It's one of the best episodes of Game of Thrones, and I don't think it gets the credit it deserves, because watching it live, like watching it for that first time, you can't appreciate everything because you don't know like what they're setting up, because you don't know anything yet. And like, I remember I'm terrible with names, so this was like my worst nightmare. I think I remember like 2 names after it, and I was confused, like who the fuck is who, who's brothers with who, which family's which. They do a decent job at explaining it, but looking back at that episode, like going back and looking back, knowing how the show ends up, it does a ridiculous amount of setup, and it's honestly one of the most like efficient pilots I've ever seen, and you don't realize it until you look back at it.
It's so interesting because for an ensemble TV show, they really set up the Starks as like main characters right away. You know, we get their point of view. There's a lot of characters in there, but it's not until, the Baratheons come to Winterfell that we get like more of a kind of open-ended like view at the rest of the cast and what the entire ensemble is going to be. They introduce us into that world through the Starks like view, but it expands. By the end of the episode, you know almost everything that you need to know to set you up for watching the rest of the season, rest of the show. And
interestingly enough too, the actual pilot that we get in Game of Thrones is the second pilot. There was a failed pilot. Now we don't exactly know. Apparently it does exist somewhere, but obviously it's never going to come to light. They recast Dany. That was one of the major decisions they made. They got in like a new director to really fine tune a lot of the things. I think they changed the script quite significantly as well. Like the first pilot was given a pretty big budget, and it completely flopped with test audiences. It just wasn't working, so they had to scrap it and redo it. And then even when they redid it and we got the pilot that we did, there were still quite a few issues with it. I think they had to ADR some scenes to make it clear that certain characters were like brother and sister in the case of Cersei and Jaime. And there were minor tweaks like that, but somehow it all actually came together. And I would go as far as say it's like a top 5 pilot in TV history for me. Yeah,
that's totally fair. Yeah, like you were saying, there was an original pilot shot. I remember there's interviews. George R.R. Martin was actually more involved with the original pilot, as far as I believe. Like he was like on set all the time. He was like heavily involved in it. There's an interview where he's talking about, they do the scene in the in this pilot with Dany and Khal Drogo
with the horse.
Yeah, the horse. Yeah. Talking about the horses fucking and stuff like that. And he kept going on about that way too much, but that's the most I know about the original pilot.
Yeah, I remember, because the horse wouldn't do the trick it wanted to do. But
jumping through fire, wasn't it? They tried to get to jump through fire or some shit.
And like I haven't read the books. Neither of us read the books, so it's important to kind of state that we don't really have that perspective. But just from knowing the story, like how do you establish so many characters in Game of Thrones like they had to do? Like think about the massive undertaking.
That's why they picked the Starks as like a point of view character.
Exactly.
They bring you in with the family that's familiar and friendly and kind of titular to the story itself. Like the title of the episode, Winter is Coming, is the words of House Stark. So you really get brought in with them, and it sets you up for introducing everyone else, and it takes off in later episodes and later seasons, obviously with more of the cast.
Yep.
But specifically that first episode, I think, really focuses on the Starks, and that's why so many people adore them as the main family, even though they're not the main characters.
They do such a great job. Like, they had to introduce about 15 different characters along with the story world, which the story world of Game of Thrones is a lot more complicated than, you know, your typical family drama, right? And I actually made a list of all the different things that the pilot successfully sets up for like future episodes or even future seasons. So it starts off with the fucking awesome teaser with the threat of the White Walkers killing the Night's Watch. Awesome scene. Loved it because it establishes the main threat of the series, right? There's two key story strands throughout Game of Thrones from beginning to end. That's the threat of the White Walkers in winter, and that's the Game of Thrones. And I think it does a great job at setting up particularly the first one in the threat of the White Walkers and winter coming. And then it also sets up like who the Night's Watch are, which is very important for Jon's arc, and what happens when you desert, which is very important for Jon's arc in season 1. It sets up Eddard Stark's character perfectly and his morals about making sure that he's the one that executes the deserter, and he makes sure that his younger son watches because he knows that that's the honorable thing to do. You know, those who pass the sentence have to swing the sword.
Ned is the most honorable character in the show, and they really set that up for him right away.
And he's a great protagonist in season 1, particularly that first episode. It also foreshadows Bran's accident that happens at the beginning, at the end of the pilot, with him being warned by his mom not to climb and how he's gonna fall one day. Does a really good job with that. It sets up Jon's lineage, which is an incredibly important part of the show right throughout, up until the very last season, actually.
So they kind of do just say, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, but it still establishes him as being a bastard, which is really important to his character. And also that conflict with Catelyn Stark. And also it introduces this interesting question of like, okay, we're being shown Ned being this ultra honorable guy, yet he has a bastard son. That doesn't make sense, and that's a really
pokes a question in your mind like right away.
Exactly, it's brilliant writing, and also introduces the direwolves, which are again very important. I wouldn't call them characters, but very
important CGI set pieces.
Exactly, for the rest of the series, and I really like that dynamic too of Jon getting like the runt of the litter, getting Ghost the white direwolf,
which is arguably the coolest looking one.
Absolutely. And then it sets up the main plot of the first season, which is the murder of the Hand of the King, Jon Arryn.
That murder mystery.
Yep. It's honestly like giving us a murder mystery was such a brilliant way to help ease the audience into like giving us something to latch onto that's quite easy to understand, right? Like the Hand of the King has been murdered. Lysa, who is Catelyn's sister, has wrote a letter saying that the Lannisters are to blame and that he was murdered, and that kind of sets in motion the events of season 1 and does a really good job at establishing that. Then we also get introduced to other characters in different parts of the realm, such as Daenerys Targaryen, and it does a great job at setting her up and her relationship with her brother. There's that line where he says like he would let all 40,000 Dothraki and their horses too fuck her if it meant he could get what he wants, which is the Iron Throne. And just it does a great job at establishing her character and his character and setting up like how they change throughout that first season. And plus their goals as well of being Targaryen, like their father was the last king, he was overthrown, they're now in exile, and what they want to get the throne back, and it does a great job at establishing that.
Well, they had to be so careful with like introducing that very early on in the series, because obviously knowing what we know now about Targaryens, watching House of the Dragon and stuff like that, the very first thing that we see of them is a sickly little brother being a freak and saying horrible things. They're really trying to make you hate Viserys and like Daenerys right away.
Yeah, and they did a great job with that, and also introduced the dragon eggs. One of the most important parts of the entire show. Obviously, dragons are like such a hallmark in the Game of Thrones universe. They're introduced here as eggs, I believe, as like a gift for the marriage with Khal Drogo.
It's a gift from, I think, Varys's friend, the guy who like owns this place and like set up the whole thing, and he kind of presents the eggs to her.
Yeah.
Apparently, those eggs are also more ancient than the dragons that are in House of the Dragon.
Really insane. Very, very important moment too. And then we also get like some little foreshadowing of like the Sansa Joffrey marriage when they like it establishes that she very much wants to live that kind of queen lifestyle and she wants to marry a prince. And
she wants that King's Landing lifestyle.
Yeah, and she has like a few looks at Joffrey. Don't know why, but you know, fair. She didn't know him at the time. It does a great job of establishing Tyrion as being like the black sheep of the Lannister family as well in just a couple of scenes, and he becomes just like an instantly likable character. And then it also establishes Jaime and Cersei's relationship, another extremely important part of the show, their incestuous relationship, which ultimately ends with Bran's accident, right? Bran climbs the wall, he shouldn't have been doing it.
Accident.
Climbs the wall, sees that Jaime and Cersei are fucking, which is obviously very problematic for the likes of Joffrey as well. And Jaime pushes them out the window, and that's the end of one of the best episodes of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, no, it brings you in, really sets you up to want to see what happens with that kind of cliffhanger ending.
Perfect cliffhanger, right?
Yeah, for real. I think of any other show where they've set up incest in the pilot episode. I don't think I can.
I can't think of any. It needs to be more of it, right?
That's how you do it. They should have taken it from Game of Thrones years ago.
But yeah, such a fantastic pilot that does a great job at not only setting up the season, but the entire show itself. There's payoffs in like the last couple of seasons of Game of Thrones from that pilot episode. It's insane. Like Jon's lineage being a big one. It's so efficient in how it sets up each character. Like we automatically get a feel for each of the characters right from the get-go, and then seeing the arcs that they go on and the transformations that happen to them is one of the most enjoyable aspects of the show for me.
Yeah, and like you were saying, some of those threads that were set up are some of the only like good parts of like the later seasons, like knowing those small parts that have been set up since the beginning, you know, their payoff is there.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it really does work.
And that's one aspect of the show in general that I think they do really well early on, is juggling so many plot points. They do it so efficiently, and because there's so many viewpoint characters, right? Like there's so many main characters, and the way that they kind of balance all of their stories all at once is really, really well done for me. I think too, like one of the standouts of season 1 was actually Daenerys' arc.
Yeah.
In season 1, I think it drops off quite significantly after that. But in season 1, I actually found her arc to be one of the most enjoyable of the entire series.
It's because they set her up well. But as well, I think, just in the whole format of the show, at the very beginning in season 1, all the characters besides Dany are kind of closer together.
Yep.
You know, you've got everyone, for the first time, you've got the Baratheons coming to Winterfell, so they're all like in the same room, under the same roof, and then gradually they get more and more separated, but Dany's the only one who's in a totally different place as far as I can recall, specifically at the beginning.
Yep.
And then they do that a lot more in later seasons. You know, everyone moves to different locations. Dany's always somewhere else, but yeah, that's the first time that you get like a significantly different viewpoint in that season, and it feels fresh. It feels good to break away from the cold dreariness of Winterfell or the heat of King's Landing.
Yeah, it's great to get a kind of like a bigger look at Westeros, right?
Yeah.
And seeing like, you know, what's beyond the narrow sea, and getting like a whole new culture as well outside of that kind of political intrigue that's the focus of King's Landing.
Yeah.
But Dany, out of all of the characters, probably undergoes like the biggest transformation in season 1.
In season 1, for sure, yeah.
Like she starts off, she's basically just her brother's little bitch, right? Like she's very subservient, she does what she's told, she doesn't really have much of a character in all honesty, right? Like
there are hints of like setting up more for her where she's got like a few girl boss moments. Yeah, overall she's really just subservient to Viserys because his way is law, you know, he's the heir.
Yeah, and fuck, he's a cunt. They do a great job. They do a great job at setting him up to be like this fucking absolutely despicable, unlikable cunt.
Truly.
And seeing Dany, like, she gets basically sold off to Khal Drogo, who is, he's a sexy man, Jason Momoa, but I don't think I'd want to be fucked by him, to be honest, especially if I was her age. It kind of starts off like she's getting raped and she's really not into it, but then to see her, she kind of she makes like some efforts with the lovemaking, right, and learning from one of the servants about how to, you know, try and connect with him more, and then they actually do end up developing like a genuine romance. Yeah,
and it might be one of the best romances in the entire show.
Honestly, like it starts off very, you know, it's not comfortable.
Yeah,
and then it starts to develop, and then we actually care about like both these characters.
Yeah,
and seeing like their romance unfold, like it's really well done, and I really enjoyed that aspect of her embracing the culture of the Dothraki.
Like she learns the language, she eats the horse heart.
Yep.
She follows their customs and their ways, and at the start, none of that. She literally is just sold off, like you said.
And contrasting that with Viserys, who never truly gets it. Like his only interest is in forming an army to take back the Iron Throne.
Yeah.
And he's never interested in trying to like learn about the culture, whereas she is, and it does a great job because he's meant to be like the leader, right? He wants to be king, but in reality it's kind of showing that she might be
a better leader.
Yeah, a more suitable leader than he'll ever be. And then we have that fucking awesome moment where we see Dany really grow in confidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And her, as her relationship blossoms, she starts to become more and more independent as well, and she stops letting her brother push her around so much. She stops him from beating her up and stuff, and then eventually he just snaps. He gets drunk, and then he demands a golden crown, and he's very frustrated about the lack of progress that he's making. Probably like one of the first truly shocking moments of the show, besides maybe the cliffhanger of the pilot, right?
Yeah,
is seeing Khal Drogo give him that golden crown.
You get a few episodes of political intrigue and a few things happen here and there, but really that episode, it's the most like shocking thing, because they've set him up. They set up Viserys as the head of the Targaryens.
Yep.
You know, the heir. He's going to do this and that. They've sprinkled Dany through there as like more of a kind of viewpoint character.
Yep.
But yeah, Viserys just getting absolutely fucking melted. Just
awesome death.
That sound of his head hitting the ground.
Bunk.
That's literally it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but that pretty much puts Dany as like the last living Targaryen.
And Dany's reaction to that as well, like she's not mad at Khal Drogo.
Yeah. Well, she goes through that in that short, like 6 episodes. She goes through that arc of subservient little bitch to finding herself as like the Khaleesi. You know, she's put as like the female leader of this Dothraki horde. And she starts to act like it more and more and more, standing up to her brother a little bit. And by the time that she sees her brother for what he truly is, she's totally fine with him being killed.
Such a great moment of the show. Like, I really, really love that death. And that's one thing Game of Thrones does really well, is their character deaths. Mm-hmm. And I think this is like the first big one of the entire series, and it kind of sets the tone of like what's to come later on. And then we also have like intrigue with Jorah, right? Like Jorah the Explorer. He's such a cool character. He's such a cool character because he's introduced to be like this really good guy that's helping Dany, right? He's helping her navigate through this kind of complicated situation.
Learn the language, kind of. He's her guide, basically.
Yeah. And we get a bit of backstory too about how he was a knight, but then he was banished. And then we find out that he's actually a fucking spy for the king. And we have that awesome moment where another spy had been sent to poison Dany.
Mm-hmm.
And
based on what Jorah had reported.
Based on Jorah's information, because she was pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If she has a son, that's a threat.
That's a Targaryen heir.
Yeah, that's a threat to Robert's reign as king. So he orders that the son be killed, or the child be killed, which in turn means she gets poisoned. And seeing Jorah like really develop, like he starts off as just being a spy, but he grows to really care for her.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that moment he decides like, no, he's not going to let that happen. He steps in and stops her, saves her life, and then instantly like he gets a lot more respect from Dany, even though he already kind of had it, right?
Yeah.
But Khal Drogo, from that moment, like he's very grateful that Jorah saved her life, and then from that point on, like Khal Drogo's not having any of it. He wants war.
Yeah.
And that kind of like catalysts his motivations towards, you know, war with Robert Baratheon. But obviously that doesn't end up happening because he gets cut. He gets a little paper cut.
Yeah, just a little bit of a shoulder cut. Just really quickly on Jorah, I wanted to say I think this season, like season 1, is the most character development he has in a season potentially throughout the whole show.
Yeah, he's great in season 1. It's just a shame what happens after that. They kind of
they kind of drop off on Jorah completely. Like, he has a few, he does things.
He becomes an incel.
Yeah, basically. He has this, he's kind of a one-note character.
Yeah.
That first kind of season where he's got that choice to make between, am I for Dany or am I for trying to get my family, like, heritage back and my position back in Westeros, or do I want to support the Targaryen queen? You know, that is the most important decision for Jorah.
Absolutely.
And it only happens in this season.
Yeah. Bit of a shame, but he's so, like, he's incredibly well written in season 1.
Yeah.
And we have that moment too, so where Khal Drogo gets cut and his wound becomes infected. Love that aspect. It's something that a lot of shows kind of overlook, like medieval stuff or fantasy stuff. They kind of don't really show, like, the fragility of life very well.
He's so badass about it, you know, like he's like, I'll take this, it doesn't matter at all, I'm a powerful Dothraki man, you know, I'm a Khal, I'll take this fucking cut from this weird curved sword.
Yep.
And yeah.
And infection fucks him, and like his decline is honestly, like, it's quite hard to watch because he is, like, such a fucking badass character. Like, he is a apex warrior, right?
He's an alpha Dothraki. And
to see him, you know, get sick and it's to the point where Dany, like, really cares for him.
Well, we kind of care about him too, as an audience.
And she will do anything to save him.
Yeah.
And that leads her to one of the first experiences with magic that we get to see with the witch. And she basically makes a deal where, like, she wants to save Khal Drogo, and it doesn't work out the way she wants it to. And unfortunately for her, she ends up losing her baby because of it. It was like a trade where she loses
for a life.
Yeah, she loses her unborn child to save Khal Drogo, and she does save him, but he's unfortunately, like, completely brain dead.
Yeah,
and
he's a total vegetable.
Yeah. So up until this point, we see a little bit of a glimpse of Dany being cold with her brother's death and stuff, but she isn't really a strong character yet. But this is the moment that propels her into that strong leader character where she decides to get revenge.
Yeah.
She decides to take that witch and burn her alive. And it's not nice either. It's not... She wants to hear her fucking scream. And we get that moment where she with her dragon eggs burns a hut with Khal Drogo's body and the witch who's alive.
Yeah. Well, you've got that funeral pyre, you know, she's put the witch on one side, she lights it up, good goodbye to her husband, good revenge against the witch, and then she goes in with the dragon eggs.
Yeah. And that final shot of season 1 where the camera pulls back and we reveal a naked Dany,
tits and dragons,
with 3 dragons that have hatched. Such an iconic moment.
Truly.
And honestly, like, makes you so excited to see, like, where it goes in season 2.
It's a hauntingly scary moment, like in that kind of way where you see it. It's like shocking. You never expected there to be dragons in the show. They kind of set it up, but at that point when you're watching it, you don't really know about it at all. You see them pop up. They look fantastic. You see those titties. It's a beautiful moment. Best way to end a season.
Yep.
Barely think anything's done it as good as that.
And her season 1 arc is a real highlight for me. I think it's one of the best aspects of season 1.
Yeah.
Incredibly enjoyable. And moving on, like, the King's Landing stuff is equally brilliant. So I think we have, like, in episode 2, that's when we leave Winterfell and we start to head towards King's Landing. I think they arrive in episode 3 or something like that. And once we get to King's Landing, like, not only have we just been introduced to, like, 15, 20 characters, now we get introduced to a whole nother batch. We get Littlefinger, we get Lord Varys, we get a bunch of other characters all thrown at us, the Hound, right?
Yeah.
And it's incredible because it really kind of establishes the Game of Thrones plotline, right?
Yeah.
About the battle for the throne and the Game of Thrones, the political intrigue that's played between the characters. And our viewpoint character in Eddard Stark, he's an honorable guy, he's a likable guy, he's a great warrior, but he's also a bit of an idiot. He's very naive, he doesn't understand this world, and he ends up paying for it. Like, we see him trying to kind of uncover, like, what happened to Bran, right? And then also the murder mystery of the last hand of the king.
Exactly.
And he's going around looking for answers, and then a lot of, like, the scenes between him and Littlefinger, him and Cersei, there's so many brilliant dialogue driven scenes in season 1 involving Eddard Stark. And honestly, like, for me, this is when Game of Thrones is nearly at its most enjoyable. Like, I absolutely loved being thrown into this cesspool of a city in King's Landing, and all of, like, the corruption and the political intrigue and the backstabbing and everything was going on, and it's good in a way that Ned's character is a bit of an idiot and makes a lot of bad decisions, because it's a great way for the audience to kind of navigate through him and learn how the world works.
Well, that's why I think it's important the way they set it up, with the Starks being the point of view characters for the first episode. You come from this like little cold wasteland of Winterfell, and you don't see King's Landing at all in the first episode, and they bring you into King's Landing. You kind of feel it along with the Starks, and you get thrown into this, like you said, a cesspool of a city, but it really does feel like the beating heart of Westeros.
Yep.
Everything's happening through there. There's so much going on, and you've got intrigue, political intrigue, you've got mystery, you've got corruption all throughout the guards of the city. It's a totally different animal. It feels like some kind of like megapolis or something compared to the rest of the show. And Ned, he is a bit of an idiot. He goes about it very like kind of blatantly, like looking into what happened to Bran, looking what happened to Jon Arryn, asked too many people.
He needed to keep his cards closer to his chest because
he
was
painted
too
a
trusting
target on himself.
Exactly. And look, he made a lot of mistakes. A lot of people made a lot of mistakes in season 1. When he arrives in King's Landing, that whole aspect of season 1 is some of like the best parts of Game of Thrones for me. I absolutely love it. We have some incredible scenes between like him and Littlefinger and Lord Varys as well. Like I think that scene's in season 1.
The like just them talking about everything and their ambitions and shit. Yeah, that's some of the most enjoyable stuff of the show.
Absolutely.
When they were together.
And it all kind of culminates, and you can kind of see like where it's going, right? Like every single scene has tension. It's one thing Game of Thrones does really well with its writing is two characters talking have an insane amount of tension between them, even if nothing's really happening. Just the dialogue sparring, it's almost like a battle within itself. And we're learning about like different characters and their motivations, and it's so rich with detail. Like you don't know whose side is Littlefinger on. Fucking no one knows.
His own side.
Yeah, exactly. And then trying to kind of figure all of this out, and then Ned learns that Joffrey is an illegitimate son of Robert. He is not Robert's son. He is a child of incest between Jaime and Cersei, and he discovers that, and he confronts Cersei, and then he pays for it.
You've got that beautiful moment where he's looking through that book, and he's like, black of hair, black of hair, black of hair, blonde of hair.
And doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's a really good moment. It's a combination of all of that kind of like detective work that he's done throughout the season, and that was always the most enjoyable part of the season, him going around talking to I think he meets Gendry in season 1 as well. He visits him in the blacksmith shop, sets up that Robert's got a lot of bastards for him to plant that seed and discover that and find out, sets up the entire War of the Five Kings and everything that's to come in the rest of the show.
And one of my favourite scenes too in season 1 is that showdown that he has with Jaime Lannister. Like Jaime to this point has just been hyped up as being like
master swordsman,
the best swordsman in all of Westeros, right? And he fucking looks it. He's cocky. He's plays that kind of evil, villainous, kind of blonde, Prince Charming character like really, really well. And seeing these two characters like kind of come together midway through season 1, such an awesome scene before unfortunately it's cut short. And one of the random goons stabs Ned in the leg. Yeah,
well, that kind of is a nice point for Jaime's character as well, because like you said, they've set him up to be this scummy, kind of arrogant Prince Charming character who's also fucking his sister, which is a huge thing. In that moment, when his goon stabs Ned through the leg with that spear, he's genuinely mad about that. Jaime has some sense of honour as a knight, and you, for the first time, I think, probably see that little bit of Jaime that everyone talks about him being the king killer. What is it? The Kingslayer. Yeah.
Kingslayer, yep.
Everyone talks about that, and he doesn't talk about that till later in the show, but it kind of gives us a glimpse of what's to come with Jaime, and there's more to him than meets the eye.
Yeah, absolutely. The way the plot unfolds, like you have the entire sequence with Robert ordering the death of Dany's child. And Ned not being for that. He doesn't want to see a child killed. So he stands down as Hand of the King. And then Robert eventually ends up getting wounded by a boar during a hunting accident. And then we kind of see him come around when he's on his deathbed and then change his mind and want to change that order. But unfortunately, it's too late. Doesn't end up mattering for them because of Jorah, but really interesting to kind of see like how Robert Baratheon, he's not a good king, right? He's more interested in whoring around. He cheats on Cersei. He just wants to hunt and get drunk, right?
Yeah.
He's not interested in being a leader. And he's in this position of power because he was like Robert Baratheon the Conqueror, right?
Well, he led the rebellion.
Yep.
You know, he was in love with Ned's sister.
Which is another thing established in the pilot as well that I forgot to mention.
They were in the crypt, that's right.
Yep.
They went underneath.
Beautiful scene.
Yep. Which was a great setup for that, but it talks about the rebellion and how him and Ned fought together. They have that beautiful moment as well, I think, in the first or second episode where they talk by the side of the road.
Yep.
Yeah, and they reminisce, and it's really like engaging scene, despite them just sitting there and talking beside the road for so long. But it gives you a hint into the rebellion and everything that happened there. Robert basically admits that he's not a good king.
Yep.
He's like, you should have come with me, you know, like it's been so hard. He goes into this world being only a warlike leader, like a conqueror, like you said. He wanted to free people from the Targaryens. He succeeded. Then he became king, and he's not done very well since then, but, you know, that's the position he's in.
And every scene that those two characters share together in season 1, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, some of like my favorite scenes, like there's that particular one where in the pilot actually where Robert says that you've got fat and Ned just does a simple little glance down at his belly and Rob laughs and to kind of establish like where these two characters stand with each other, right? Like yes, he's a king. You say that to a king, you suggest that the king's fat, like you're getting beheaded, but these two characters, they've been through a lot. And I really enjoyed that aspect and how much Robert really respects him and how he travelled all of that way to make sure that he got Ned to be hand of the king, and why Ned actually, you know, took him up on that offer as well. But unfortunately, it ended up being a bad decision because Ned chose to trust the wrong people. He put his trust in Littlefinger and went to the throne room to basically take down Joffrey.
Right. So Robert wrote him a little note that says, until the time where Joffrey is old enough, Ned will rule in my stead as hand of the king, as kind of king regent.
Which was a wise decision because Joffrey was not king material.
True. And he was also way too young and too immature, and Robert knew that. The one like mistake he made though is sending everyone else in the room out to do that, getting Ned to write the letter and then like signing it at the very end. And
so he approaches Joffrey with this piece of paper and they kind of make that comment about like, you have no claim. What is a piece of paper? And that's where we have Littlefinger betray him. And it ends that episode with like, I told you shouldn't trust me.
Yeah.
And it's such a brilliant moment that throws Ned into a situation where like he's the main character. He's facing execution.
Yeah.
He's in a world of trouble. And I remember watching that thinking like, how is he going to get out of this? And they do a great job of establishing like different ways about how he's going to get out of it. Like there's all these other characters saying like, this can't even happen. Cersei herself is like, no, we can't kill Ned, right? And she's a pretty evil character. Maybe not so much at this point, but we see her as a villain. And all things point towards him being freed. And maybe we kind of think like, oh, okay, he'll go back to Winterfell. What's going to kind of happen from here?
Yeah.
So he's taken up in front of the entire city. Joffrey, being the little shit that he is, power hungry upon his new appointment of being king, decides to go rogue. He doesn't listen to Cersei, he doesn't listen to his advisors at all, and demands that Ned be killed for his crimes.
This is exactly what Robert was worried about. You know, like Joffrey, the way that he is, how rash and impulsive. Ned thought that he was going to get through this situation. He went into that throne room thinking he was going to be okay, gets betrayed. It goes worse and worse and worse and worse from there, up until the point where he's beaten down, he's injured already from his fight with Jaime, kept in the black cells for so many days. He's offered a way out. You know, you admit to doing all of these things wrong, basically coming out saying that you're not honourable, saying that you've committed treason, that you're sorry, and then you'll be sent to the Night's Watch. Like, that's the best option you've got. He does that. He gets up in front of the entire fucking city and says, yeah, I'm a shit, kind of done the wrong thing. And that is supposed to save his life. He sacrifices the one thing that's most important to him, his honour, to try and protect his life, because that's what Sansa asked him to do. And in the end, Joffrey's like, nah, fuck it anyway, we're just going to kill you. So he loses not only his life, but he loses his honour that he values above everything else in that last moment. So it's kind of like a double death for him.
Yeah, and that moment, arguably one of the most shocking moments in television history.
Truly.
Because he is the protagonist.
Yeah, they set him up as the main character from the get-go.
Yep.
You know, like you've got all of those other point of view characters, but he's the real main one, the one that you're following, the one that you're most invested in.
Even though they cast Sean Bean, the man that dies on screen more than any other man in the history of men, even though they cast Sean Bean, I still didn't believe that he would die. So to kill off the main character of the series 9 episodes through a long-running series like they did. It came out of absolute nowhere, and the way it's done as well, like, they established so many different ways. Like, I still think that, like, Arya is gonna somehow save her dad, or
she's there watching.
Or I think Cersei's just gonna step in and overrule Joffrey, or
she does try.
Yeah, like something's gonna happen because he can't die. Like, he does die. The way that just fucking flips the show on its head, like, everything we know is just completely gone.
Yeah.
What the fuck is gonna happen now? Right, we've just lost our protagonist. And then seeing episode 10, which is another incredible episode to follow up on that. Like, Arya trying to escape the city, right? Because of the outfall. Sansa being basically taken prisoner, right? And you held as a hostage. Robb hearing that his father's being killed and then declaring war on the Lannisters and the
Jon
kingdom
as well, you know, hearing that at the Night's Watch, deciding that he has to go and avenge his father out of honor, you know.
Jon's whole internal struggle of, you know, he's at the Night's Watch, he's having problems getting along with people because of his background, coming from like a very
class
prestigious family, right? And a very wealthy upbringing. He's not really getting along, and he has that moment where he wants to go and leave and join Robb in that rebellion and get justice for Ned Stark, but ultimately he decides to stay. But just the repercussions for the entire story world,
it ripples through the entire show,
and it lasts exactly until the very end.
And truly,
seriously, one of the most impressive moments I think in television history is the way they handled that. Beautifully shot too. I love that cutaway of the birds and Arya being held in the arms of that soldier.
Of that Night's Watch guy.
Like a truly incredible moment, and it does a great job because basically season 2 ends up just kind of picking up where we left off and dealing with those repercussions. Like, season 2 isn't a big plot heavy season like season 1 is. Like, season 1 we have that murder mystery, and
it changes formats.
And then we kind of change into this fresh season where we're dealing with all of those ripples from that big event. There's not really as many like big plot points in season 2, but it's more about setting up what's to come, and I think it does a great job at doing that. Dealing with the fallout of Ned's death is another aspect of the show that I really enjoy. Like seeing how fired up the North is about Ned being killed, because we know like how great of a person Ned was, and seeing Robb, you know, declare war in honor to get justice for his father.
You get fired up with them.
Absolutely.
You know, you feel like you want to join North fucking remembers. Let's go march south and get him.
And Joffrey becomes, in that moment, one of the most hated characters in television history.
I feel really bad for the actor. It kind of ruined his life, you know, like doing this role.
He was fucking terrific though. Like,
he was really good at what he did, but for like a relatively new actor in one of his like first like major roles to be the most hated character in television history.
It's crazy because he's such a lovely person. I listened to a interview with him, and he's really quite a lovely guy. So
bro, he's like a teacher now.
It's a great acting by him. But let's talk about season 2. I think season 2 isn't as good as season 1. I think season 1's definitely a much stronger season, but season 2 does a great job at keeping the momentum going, and it does a great lot of setup. First of all, we're introduced to a batch of new characters. Surprise, surprise, Game of Thrones doing its typical thing, doesn't have enough characters ever. So we get introduced to Stannis Baratheon. He's an interesting character, I would say. That maybe falls a bit flat. I don't think he ever lives up to the potential he had, but Stannis the Menace. He
was set up in season 1 as well. A lot of these characters they introduce at the start of season 2 have been talked about and set
They get mentioned, exactly. And to finally see him and they kind of establish him to be a threat for the throne. And this is where the Game of Thrones really kind of like ramps up a bit, and we see all of the contenders for the throne. Like, we've got Dany now, we've got Stannis, we've got Stannis' younger brother, what's his name? Renly. Obviously Joffrey in charge, and then we have Robb, and it's starting to get to a point where we're really ramping up all of these different stories and how that kind of unfolds.
Not only that, but we have something that was set up at the end of season 1 as well. Ned finding out the truth of Joffrey's birth. He actually sent out ravens to a lot of different people,
Yep.
including Stannis. Rob's got his reasons for wanting to take the throne,
Yep.
revenge for his father. But then all these other kings are wanting to seize their opportunity, realizing that maybe Robert was murdered, maybe there was something not quite right with that, but also they have more claim to the throne. Renly and Stannis have more claim than Joffrey does if he's a bastard son.
Yep. One aspect of season 2 that I liked a lot was seeing Joffrey really settle into that role as king.
Yeah.
Because honestly, like, some of his scenes where he's just an evil bastard are so incredibly entertaining. Like,
They're disgusting.
you have that moment at the end of season 1 where he makes Sansa like look at the decapitated head of her father
On a spike.
Yeah, and she goes to push him, but the Hound steps in and stops her from doing so. But yeah, Joffrey becoming king is such a enjoyable aspect because he is so hated and no one can kind of rein him in. Season 2 is all about him just being a loose goose and Cersei not being able to control him.
Cersei tries.
She tries her best, but she can't do it. The dynamic with Sansa as well, and poor Sansa, like, just in this fucking situation where she's with the monster that she's meant to marry now.
Yeah.
And her trying to kind of deal with that. Like, all of the stuff in King's Landing continues to be excellent. And then we have Arya's arc, which is honestly probably my favorite aspect of season 2, if I'm being honest, is her escaping King's Landing and her kind of like band of brothers little gang that she gets with Hot Pie and Gendry, and I really like that aspect and how she saves Jaqen Hagar. Yeah.
It starts off a little rough, honestly, with her escaping, like, where does she go from here? She does have that little, like, band that she sets up.
Yeah.
And they're on the run. They're trying to get to the Night's Watch. She's with a bunch of criminals. They set up that little Jaqen Hagar thing. But it's not until later in the season, not until the Harrenhal stuff, the Arya stuff, gets really good.
Absolutely. And for me, the Harrenhal stuff is the highlight of season 2 for myself. Yeah. I think season 2 in a lot of ways treads water a little bit.
It's slower.
It has a lot going on in terms of setup, but not a lot going on in terms of action. But with that, we actually get some of the slower moments. And for me, like, some of my favorite parts of Game of Thrones are these more subtle and slow moments. That conversation between Arya and Tywin Lannister when she becomes like the cupbearer or something like that.
Yeah. So he comes to Harrenhal. He takes her as his cupbearer, and he notices immediately that she is more educated.
Yeah.
She's smarter than she looks, and he also is the only one to notice that he's a she.
Yeah.
And he takes her on as that, and the relationship that they have, despite him not knowing who she is and how much she hates him, it's really cool. It's a really cool dynamic.
And we get that conversation too, where they're talking about the Targaryens, which actually links perfectly to House of the Dragon.
Yeah, they literally talk about Rhaenyra and stuff like that.
It's incredible, and I really love all of those scenes that those two characters share together. I mean, Charles Dance is probably the most impressive actor in the entire show for me. And
he does really well.
I really, really love his character as well. Like, Tywin Lannister, he's an evil bastard.
Yeah.
But in these scenes with Arya, it's probably like the most relatable and likable he's ever become. He's like a real grandfather figure almost.
You get him a few times in season 1 and a few like sporadic scenes, but in season 2, the way they kind of like bring him in and show this different side to him through his conversations with Arya makes him much more likable compared to some of the other like evil or villainous characters in the show.
Yeah, the whole setup too of like the faceless men as well with Jaqen Hagar.
Yeah.
Really cool. Didn't end up eventuating all that well, but it was a really cool setup. Season 2 really starts to sprinkle in like a bit more magic into this fantasy world. Like, we get Melisandre with the whole kind of
everything that she does.
Yeah, pretty much her being just a witch and everything with Stannis and that baby that she makes with him.
The shadow baby.
Yeah, and we get that the faceless men kind of intrigue as well, and it's some nice world building moments that set up for later seasons, which is kind of what I think season 2. It's more of a setup season, in all honesty.
Like we said, they changed format, the first being like more of a murder mystery. This one, they're really trying to set up that episode 9, episode 10 kind of arc for the series.
Yeah. And it's another aspect of the setup as well as with Jon's arc. We get to know the Night's Watch, and we introduce a little bit to like what's beyond the wall and that kind of threat of Whitelings.
The White Walkers, the Wildlings and the White Walkers, And it's sprinkled in season 1, you get a little bit of it.
Season 2 is where we really get to see it.
You literally dive into it.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that aspect. Really want to know what's like beyond the wall. Of course, they take a party through. I forget why they do it. They go to investigate the wildlings kind of like retreating, or they go to investigate the White Walkers.
Yeah, I can't quite remember the exact specifics, but I think that's where we're introduced to like the baby dynamic, I think, where the babies are getting like sold essentially.
Yeah,
so they can
through
live.
Craster.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. Yeah.
That whole section with Craster is really cool.
Yeah, and that comes back a few times later throughout the show as well, like Craster's Keep and Craster as a character. But I think we finally get to see the Night's Watch doing what the Night's Watch does. You know, like traveling north, a whole world that is totally different from the rest of Westeros, and this whole like race of people kind of separated from modern times, and everyone considers to be savages and stuff in their kind of lifestyle. It really brings us into that kind of different dynamic that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed a lot of Jon's stuff in the first 2 seasons of Game of Thrones. I think it's nice.
He develops.
It's nice and slow, and we really see him mature. Some really beautiful moments where he gets like sworn in season 1, and then in season 2, seeing how he's really being propped up as being the next leader of the Night's Watch for the future.
He's got that kind of pedigree and that prestige, and he's got those skills to be able to lead and be a ranger. Lord Commander Mormont, he sees in him the next Lord Commander, and he takes him as a steward, which he's initially pissed about, but ends up being really, really good for him. He still gets to be Jon Snow, but just in a more of a kind of apprentice way.
He has a lot of really cool internal conflicts. Like in season 1, it's all about, will he abandon the Night's Watch to go join Robb? And he ultimately decides to stay with the Night's Watch. Then in season 2, we're introduced to the character of Ygritte, who is a wildling, and they fall in love. And then the rule is you're not allowed to have sex, and you're not allowed to marry or anything like that. You're not allowed to have children as a member of the Night's Watch. Yet Jon feels very conflicted because he's fallen in love with a wildling of all people as well, and that whole kind of dynamic really sets up the future seasons as well, and what ends up happening with Jon.
That comes into it a bit more in season 3, but they set it up really well with that kind of like light sexualization, a little bit of chemistry between them really early on when they do introduce Ygritte. They feel something for each other when he is brought in to the wildling camp. Which we see more of in season 3, but heading that way, it's a very good setup for that.
Absolutely, Like season 3 and 4 of Jon's kind of arc is exceptional. And I think it's because of the work season 2 does. It lays the foundations and kind of maybe is less exciting and a bit more boring, but it pays off in the long run. And Ygritte was right. Jon Snow doesn't know anything.
Look, they really try to set him up after Ned as it's obviously a multifocal point TV
Budget
show.
Ned.
Budget Ned, but they try to set Jon up as like more of the protagonist of the show, the kind of like lead character. And in those first 2 seasons, you do get to see him come from a bastard boy, kind of becoming his own kind of man, getting sworn in, making his own decisions, and having to fight against his moral and immoral choices. It's good. It's good stuff. You get to see Jon moving on. You get to see Jon like really becoming his own type of character. Unfortunately, it does kind of drop off later on, but those first 2 seasons are good for him. They make me really like Jon.
Absolutely. And another character that's a standout in season 2 is Tyrion. I think season 1, he's kind of just going around, right? He's on a tourist visa.
He's charismatic.
He explores, we actually get to navigate like a fair bit of Westeros because of Tyrion going on this like
little
sightseeing tour, where we get to see him at the Vale, and obviously the way he meets Bronn and that whole dynamic. We get to learn a bit more about the Lannisters and how we get the term Lannisters always pay their debts, and how he's very much the black sheep of the family. Like his own family don't really like him. The relationship with Jaime, how he's really the only one in the entire family that likes him.
True.
And then heading into season 2, he's a character that just gets a lot more characterization. He's a very likable character in season 1, but season 2, he really starts to step up, I'd say, as the series protagonist. I think he replaces Ned probably more than Jon, because Jon's kind of isolated from the events of King's Landing, right?
True.
Tyrion is right there in the middle. He is the new hand of the king.
Well, he's put into the same position
exactly
that Jon Arryn and Ned Stark was in.
And one thing I love about Tyrion is he's just genuinely like an intelligent character.
Yeah, you get to see him shine in what he really does. Like, Tyrion is at his best when he is in that political intrigue, and he does it so much better than Ned does. You know, he's not
absolutely.
that kind of honourable guy. He's willing to get in there and play dirty with everyone else, and he does it so fucking well.
Yeah.
So well.
All of the scenes involving Tyrion talking to someone in a room in King's Landing in season 2, that's peak Game of Thrones. That's why I fell in love with the show.
Yeah.
And I think Game of Thrones, more than any other TV show, does writing dialogue fucking incredibly well. Like, to me, the dialogue scenes in Game of Thrones, particularly in season 2, like season 2 is a real standout for this. They're better than the action sequences, and they're more tense than the action sequences. Like, I am hanging for every fucking word. We get so much information conveyed and so efficiently, and links to what's happened in the past. We get discussions about what might happen in the future. We get to learn about character motivations and how they're always changing, and the different dynamics that characters have with each other, like Littlefinger conversing with a prostitute compared to talking to Tyrion, and that kind of whole dynamic. Tyrion and trying to rein in Joffrey, being Hand of the King to Joffrey, and the struggles he's having there. Obviously, the relationship with Cersei. It's the first time these two characters are really together, and we get to learn just how fucking much they hate each other. There's that scene where Cersei basically outright says that Tyrion murdered their mom.
And she blames him for that. And Tywin said that before as well. But yeah, it's a battle of words in season 2. Like we said, it's a slower kind of pace, and that allows for these kind of moments, but they're done so perfectly that you don't mind at all.
With Tyrion too, like, his story is really important to the overall plot, and I really like that kind of setup where we get introduced to Stannis, and realistically, like, we should probably be on the side of Stannis a little bit. And then obviously Renly dying is a bit of a problem, seeing the magic being used, but ultimately, like, it's all building up to Stannis attacking King's Landing. And then we have Tyrion trying to figure out throughout season 2, like, what the fuck he's gonna do if that happens. And we get introduced to another magic element of the show with the wildfire.
I wouldn't say that's so much magic, it's more of a kind of science,
yeah.
It's alchemy.
Yeah, it's a fantasy aspect, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to see him kind of like learning about that, and then have that pay off later in episode 9, with when the battle goes down, and that's a episode where Tyrion really gets to shine.
That episode really shines.
Yeah,
really shines green.
I think it saves the series as well. Like, season 2 up to that point was probably like maybe a lot of people were getting turned off a little bit, right?
Yeah,
but I think Blackwater just reestablished that they can actually do action.
Although there wasn't a lot of action in the first season as well, this season was definitely a lot slower.
Yeah.
And not everyone would enjoy that kind of stuff. There was less tits, there was less violence, less to like bring in the mainstream kind of person. That episode 9, that Blackwater Bay, sells it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of storylines that really meander in throughout the season.
Oh my god.
But they all ramp up, and I think season 2 ends really, really strongly.
Yeah.
And I think too, like, a lot of the reason why season 1 and 2 are like a fair bit slower is just because of the budget restraints.
True.
Like, there are a lot of instances where, you know, for example, early on, Tyrion is meant to have like this big battle, and then we just kind of cut away from it. We don't see the battle with like the Starks and Lannisters, and he's just kind of like wakes up being injured from it. And yeah, I think if Game of Thrones had like a bigger budget, then we probably would have got to have a whole episode centered around that battle. Yeah. But instead, they kind of had to show a bit of restraint and focus on things that are more important, right? And I think that's one aspect I really admire about season 1 and 2 is they really focus more on the characters and the story more so than the spectacle. And
well,
I think
they do that a lot too. You know, like there's a moment I think in season 2 where Rob and Jamie have a massive battle out in the field.
Yeah,
we don't see even a tiny little bit of that.
Yeah, and it's a big fucking moment.
Like, it has ramifications for the rest of the show.
Yep.
It's one of Rob's first victories. It's against Jamie, who's like a proven commander.
Yep.
And yeah, we don't see any of it.
And it's important because Jamie's like a villain and Rob's taking over as like a real hero character, right? So not seeing that, for a lot of people, that might be seen as a bit of a weak point. But for me, knowing where the show kind of ends up later on, right? I really do appreciate that they had those budget restraints, because in my opinion it made for more effective storytelling. It focused on things that were more important.
They would have wasted an episode, I think, spending a lot of time on that battle. It would have been cool, it would have been expensive and they wouldn't have been able to do some of the other stuff they wanted to do in the first 2 seasons.
Yeah.
If they spent time doing stuff like that, which is more mainstream.
I think season 2 like is really where they kind of showed like, okay, if they do get a bit of a budget, they can do some special things with it.
Yeah.
And then season 3 onwards is where like the budgets just get bigger and bigger. The production value gets bigger and bigger. And in the long run, I think that actually ends up hurting the show.
It does. They have some really nice visual moments and some amazing spectacles later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wish they kind of just kept the same budget because they kind of lost it.
Yeah.
They kind of lost what was really special about those first 2 seasons when they start being like, oh, we can do CGI mess. And they end up relying on those things that we were just talking about instead of focusing on the characters and the dialogue.
Yeah, like showing that restraint, I think, really helped the story, and there was more of a focus on the writing in those first few seasons. And for me, that's like some of my favorite aspects of Game of Thrones, like that political intrigue and exploring like the repercussions of Ned's death and the battle for the throne and how everyone's kind of trying to, you know, find out who their allies are and who that whole kind of intrigue is so engaging to me. And
season 1 sets up who can you trust, and then season 2 has you directly asking that question to every single character. Every character has a claim to the throne, like all the War of the Five Kings, all of those 5 kings, they have a legitimate claim to the throne, except maybe Joffrey. But yeah, it sets up something that's really, really cool and not something that you really see in other shows. Like, think about The Walking Dead, which was airing at the same time. It's got your big kind of like zombie madness, horror, gore, and action and things like that. And Game of Thrones was just pure in those first 2 seasons, political intrigue and bliss and beautiful writing. It's so different.
Absolutely. I think the writing in like the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, probably some of the best television writing like we've ever got. And I think a lot of that really comes down to George R.R. Martin. I think we definitely see a steep decline later on in terms of the writing quality, but when he was on board as like in the writers' rooms, which were for the first 4 seasons, the writing is so incredible. Some of the monologues from characters, some of the sparring from characters, like there's so many memorable scenes where the only thing that happens is a conversation. And I really love that aspect of Game of Thrones. Another thing that Game of Thrones does a really good job at setting up episode 9 being the big episode.
So the penultimate episode.
So typically in television, you'll usually have your final episode of the season be the big one, right? It's the big finale. Everyone's like the grand final of the show, right? It gets really hyped up. Game of Thrones kind of throws that out the window a little bit. Any episode can be that episode. But it does establish episode 9, the penultimate episode, being the 10 out of 10 episode. It's the most, like, the biggest spectacle. It's the thing.
It's that peak, you know?
We've had the rising action. This is the climax. And then episode 10 generally focuses on, like, the falling action and showing the repercussions of what happened.
That kind of recovery from the major.
And I love that format. I really, really love that format.
It's good. It gives you breathing room.
In episode 9 in season 1 and 2, like, Baelor and Blackwater, like, 2 of the best episodes in Game of Thrones ever, and it's continued in future seasons as well, with episode 9 being that like crazy standout. So much so, like it became like a genuine meme where people were like, I can't fucking wait for episode 9, right? Like everyone was hyped to see what episode 9 would deliver in future seasons. So let's talk about some of the characters. So one character we haven't really discussed too much is Cersei. Now, I find her to be really interesting in the earlier seasons because she kind of gets established as not really being like a major player. She's more so just Joffrey's mum. But my god, is she a phenomenal character in this series. Like, she plays the strong female villain character so well. And I really love like all of the different conversations she has with Joffrey, with Tyrion, with Jaime, with Tywin Lannister,
with Robert
father,
too.
With Robert. Yeah, like for me, like she's a character that, although she's very, very dislikable, she also has her moments. Like I think in Blackwater where she nearly chooses to kill her sons. Like that's a real empathetic moment for her character. The moment with Rob as well on his deathbed where they kind of like share that moment. We feel a bit sorry for her because Rob loved Ned's sister, right? And because of that, like he never really fully committed to Cersei as a wife, and you know that
he married more for the kind of like that's what he was
the
told
political
to do.
reasons.
Exactly. Lannisters are a powerful family. Obviously Tywin was loyal to the Targaryens as Hands of the King. Not the end. He did come on to Rob's side at the end, like Robert's side at the end. But yeah, it was a good marriage for him, and it was necessary. And obviously, with Lyanna out of the way, it was the only option he had left. And you can tell that Cersei despises him multiple times. Obviously, he has all of his bastard kids as well throughout the city, so their relationship wasn't super happy. Obviously, Cersei's in a relationship with her brother.
Awkward.
And she is strong. She's a strong character right from the get-go. You know? She speaks, the way she speaks, she has venom laced behind her words.
Yeah, that's a perfect way of describing her. And I particularly love the scenes that she shares with Sansa.
Yeah.
And she kind of becomes like almost a mother figure for Sansa, poor Sansa.
In a toxic kind of way. You know, like she's kind of almost grooming her. There's a few moments where she's like really real with her.
Yeah.
And she kind of levels the playing field. But apart from that, it's her like manipulating her. And the way she does it is so masterful.
She understands how the world works.
Yeah, she plays that Game of Thrones. She fits into King's Landing so well. And there's a part of me that thinks maybe she was like Sansa when she originally came to King's Landing. Maybe she was a bit like that. And she's trying to look out for Sansa in her own way. But, you know, she's also taking advantage of her and everyone else that she speaks to and meets.
Yeah. And Sansa, too, is another character that is quite interesting to talk about in those early seasons of Game of Thrones. For me, in general, like, she's one of the weaker characters in Game of Thrones for me.
Throughout the whole run.
But I do enjoy season 1 and 2 of her a bit more, because season 1 she's established to be this very unlikable brat.
Yeah.
Right?
She's bratty, she's whiny.
She's the least likable Stark, for sure.
Besides maybe Rickon. Fuck.
Who the fuck is Rickon? But yeah, no, Sansa she's a dislikable character, and she's kind of pitted against Arya a fair bit.
Yeah.
And fucking every audience member takes Arya's side, right? Like, everyone loves Arya, no one likes Sansa, and that kind of continues. And then we see like her have to deal with her father's death, and then in season 2 she becomes a lot more sympathetic, and I think in turn becomes a fair bit more likable. Like, she's very naive, and she's starting to learn like the way the world works, and it's really interesting to kind of navigate King's Landing through her eyes and the way she's learning. And I really like too how Littlefinger kind of sinks his claws into her later on as well.
He lays the seeds for that in these earlier seasons as well. But she just gets taken advantage of almost every opportunity. You know, and she makes some dumb decisions on her own, whether it's because she's scared or because she is being manipulated. But you just feel really bad for her, and it's kind of hard to like follow along and like her just because of the situations that she's in. Just makes me feel bad, like, every time I see her. You know, Joffrey's doing something bad to her. She's upset about her dad. Cersei's being mean to her. You know, there's a few moments, like with Tyrion protecting her, which sets up some good kind of relationship for them later on as well in future seasons. Or Shae, Tyrion's whore. Like, they have a few good kind of, like, friendly moments together, and it's nice seeing her have some of those nice parts. But yeah, Sansa to me isn't very enjoyable in the earlier seasons or throughout the entire show, really. She does have a few moments, but she's not my favourite character.
I think she's a bit better in these kind of seasons than...
She has more development.
Yeah.
You know, like, you get to see everything that she experiences in King's Landing.
And how it changes her.
Yeah, and she does change from it, which is, at the very least, you can say she does grow and learn.
Yeah, let's talk about Renly.
Yeah.
So, I feel like we kind of glossed over him a little bit. He's a character that's kind of in the background in season 1.
Yeah.
And then in season 2, he becomes like a major character, like one of the potential kings for the throne.
Well, he's on the small council in season 1. He's there. He's definitely a part of it. He knows how to play the Game of Thrones. He does warn Ned about specific things and trying to set things up, and knows that Cersei and the Lannisters will take advantage of the situation as soon as they can, because he's been there and he has that experience. But yeah, season 2, he has a claim to the throne, and he amasses a backing, and there's a lot of people that actually want to see Renly on the throne, including one of the wealthiest families in Westeros, the Tyrells.
Yeah. I really like that aspect too, of having this homosexual character, and then we're introduced to Marjorie, who I absolutely adore. Marjorie.
Natalie Dormer.
Yeah,
Whoa, yeah.
Beautiful woman. But we're introduced to her, and she's aware that he's gay, and is not interested in her whatsoever. But she doesn't care about that. She cares about the political side, and she needs to have a son. She needs to marry him. I really like that whole aspect. Typical Game of Thrones fashion, it throws a spanner in the works. Like, who could have predicted Stannis having a, demon child?
Shadow demon.
Shadow child assassin, that's himself, to go and kill his brother in the way that unfolds. And the way they kind of set up Brienne as well, with Catelyn Stark as well being involved. I really enjoyed all of that aspect of the show for me. Like that whole little arc where we're introduced to Brienne and she's like, I'll become your protector.
Yeah.
He immediately dies, didn't do a very good job, Brienne. And then she becomes Catelyn's protector, I believe.
Look, she's a bit flip-floppy early on, but she's an interesting character to introduce.
Yeah, and just that spanner in the works of, okay, we're going to have a shadow demon murder one of the major characters of the show. And I do like the kind of, like in season 1 with Ned's death, like the repercussions of that.
Yeah.
Of that moment.
Well, it sets up Stannis as well. It says a lot about who he is as a person, willing to use this crazy fucking dark magic from a red priestess to murder your own little brother, just so you have a better claim to the throne.
Yeah.
Renly specifically, I think, probably would have made a really good king.
Out of all of like the kind of
options,
he was one of the better ones. I think him
truly.
And Rob were clear standouts in that regard.
Rob's like Robert, you know, like he is a good leader. He would have been a good war leader as well, you know. Just don't think he would have made a fantastic king.
Not for the entire like throne, but yeah.
And he wouldn't have thrived in King's Landing.
No, he would have lasted about as long as his dad did, but
specifically just about Renly's camp, the introduction of the Tyrells and Loras and Marjorie is really important for later seasons, but Marjorie is such a good contrast to Cersei in the way that she...
And Sansa.
Yeah, truly. She also knows how to play that game and be manipulative, but she does it in such a different way that you can barely ever tell what's really real with Marjorie.
Yeah.
Like, it comes in later a lot, like in the later seasons, not so evident in this, but she's playing that game. She sees Renly as an option to be queen and sit on the throne. She backs him as the best option, and she is one of the most interesting characters, and probably one of, maybe if not the most interesting character set up in season 2.
Yeah, and kind of goes back to that point of season 2 just setting up so much more for the future seasons to capitalize on. Another standout character for me was Sandor Clegane, the Hound. Right. Season 2, he really shines. It's probably one of his best seasons, I'd say. Throughout, he's kind of been seen as like a bit of a villain. Yeah. I like the fact he's such an interesting character. Like you have in season 1 the fight with his brother, the Mountain, and how they're mid-battle and he gets called to stop and he immediately stops and just ducks under the Mountain's sword swing, and it shows how subservient he is. He gets referred to as the Hound or dog, right? Basically, like, very much he listens to what he's been told. And then in season 2 he undergoes like a bit of a character transformation. I like some of the moments he has with Sansa, right? Like obviously he stops her at the end of season 1 from trying to kill Joffrey, and disguises it by like trying to like fix her wounded cheek after she was slapped by Joffrey. And then he finds out in season 2 that Sansa has had her first period, which has dangerous repercussions for her if someone finds out, because it means she's ready for
Joffrey's children.
Yeah, which is absolutely not what you want. and yeah, just his character is really interesting because right throughout season 2 he's kind of undergoing these subtle changes, and then it all culminates in episode 9, which we'll discuss a little bit later, where he just fucking quits. He quits the King's Guard, and
it's good development for him. Yeah, for sure. In season 2, I've never loved the Hound as much as some other people. Like he's got many good moments.
He's a very blunt character, and I like that aspect.
Yeah. You know, he also swears the most.
Yeah, there's a lot of characters where they like talk very flowery, and there's battle of words. He's blunt, you know.
He's a good contrast to the King's Landing kind of characters.
Exactly.
He definitely doesn't thrive in there, and he's more of a violent kind of brutish dude. He definitely has some kind of moral compass, as is seen in season 2 and season 1. He saves Sansa, obviously, from being assaulted. I believe that's in season 2. He's got a good moral compass, even though he does some fuck things like kill that butcher's boy.
Look, he's not a saint, but he was ordered to do that, and that was kind of befitting of his character. True. Right? So,
and where he was at that moment before he, says fuck off.
Yeah, exactly. And another character I really want to talk about is Samwell Tarly.
So we haven't even spoken about Sam.
Yeah. Sam's actually one of my favorite characters in all of Game of Thrones. For the simple reason that like there's so many badass characters in Game of Thrones. Like you have your warriors, you have your like leaders, you have the deceitful background characters like Littlefinger who get their way through. And then you just have Sam, who's just an ordinary fat dude. He's not really good at much.
He's your wimpy little neckbeard.
Yep, he's not very good at much, and he's thrown into a situation where he just absolutely doesn't belong in the Night's Watch. I really love his backstory, where basically his father hates him so much and thought he was so useless that he banished him from the family. Very prestigious family, the Tylees.
Yeah.
And sent to the Night's Watch, basically, to get rid of him.
Just so he doesn't have to carry the Tarly name anymore.
Yeah, he's such a lovable character, because he's one of the very, 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 very few characters in the entire show that is genuinely a good person. Yeah. With no shades of grey or evil.
He's not hiding anything.
No.
You know, he is who he is from the start, and he's pretty useless initially.
Yep.
We don't get to see much of his talent until a little bit later on. Obviously, he's more of a well-read, kind of intelligent character.
Yep.
That doesn't always pay off. Sometimes pays off a little bit, but not in season 1 and 2. Not really.
I love the contrast, though, that he has with John, because John is fucking elite at everything. Yeah. Right? He is the most talented. He is the obvious candidate for being a future leader. And Sam is the complete opposite of that. He is, like you said, a rather useless character. But I do also like the things that he teaches John. And their friendship, for me, is one of my favourite aspects of the early seasons.
They do have a good friendship, a good little, brotherhood, those two. Obviously, John takes a liking to him right away, wants to protect him, and kind of, asks why he's there. But it sets up a really good relationship, and it's a good contrast, because Sam, being more intelligent, he sees things that John can't, like being made steward of Lord Commander Mormont. Sam is the one who tells him, you're being groomed for command. You have to see that. So
let's move on to some of the issues we have with season 1 or 2. So for me, one of the biggest problems I think I have with the first 2 seasons of Game of Thrones is simply some of the padding that exists. So I think a lot of people like to look back with rose-tinted glasses, right, at the earlier seasons and say they did no wrong, but it's simply not true. These seasons, they have a lot going on, and with that comes quite a lot of faults. Yeah, there's a lot of problems. The early seasons, every season of Game of Thrones has this problem, but season 1 and season 2 in particular, they seem to have a lot of padding / filler scenes where not a lot happens. And I would say a lot of those sex scenes kind of fall into that category.
Unfortunately.
Of course, it's great to see some sex. It wasn't ultra commonplace to see that level of gratuity and nudity.
Yeah, at that time, yeah.
But for me, it's got to be with characters I care about. Like Jon and Ygritte, it's earned.
Yeah.
Right? With Rob and his wife. Those sex scenes are worth it, because they're
building something
exactly.
For the story.
It's important to the story. It's important to the characters. I don't think I needed to see Theon fuck as many women as he did.
I need to see Theon fuck anyone.
Yeah, I don't think I needed to see Theon's flaccid penis immediately after finishing, which doesn't make sense. Still bothers me to this day. I don't think I needed to see as many brothel scenes as I did. I don't mind it when it's important to the story, but there is a fair bit of gratuity. And later seasons cut that gratuity out a bit, but it is kind of a staple of the show, I guess, is having some scenes that they don't really provide any value to the show, and they're very skippable. I think season 1 and 2 falter with a lot of that.
Well, you said, in season 1, there are a lot of people reference it as porn with dragons and swords, and they kind of. I feel like they had a quota to hit with that for the second season. They were like, that worked, that got us a lot of notoriety. We'll keep doing that. And they just kind of inserted a few scenes in there just to hit that kind of quota that didn't really service the story at all.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is unfortunate. But I don't mind.
Fair. Well, 14, 15-year-old me didn't mind either. Another aspect too, I think, so like I mentioned earlier, season 1, one of my favourite aspects was Daenerys' character arc.
Mm-hmm.
Season 2, though, big decline in that regard. Her whole story in season 2 is a huge drop off in season 1. I think for 4 or 5 episodes they're just kind of wandering through the fucking desert.
Literally, it's some of the worst. It's maybe the worst Dany's is.
Yeah.
Especially in the good seasons of Game of Thrones. Her whole arc in Karth, totally useless, waste of time.
Yeah.
Doesn't really do anything to develop her story any further. They introduce some plot points that are never brought up ever again, and it just feels shit. I remember watching through, rewatching it all again recently.
Yep.
The specific parts in season 2 with Dany got super bored.
It's a slog.
Yeah.
Yeah. It brings
hard to watch.
Where the rest of the show feels like it's building, Danny's season 2 arc feels like it's treading water.
It's just standing still.
Yeah.
Literally. Almost every single other arc in season 2 is building towards a really intense climax, and they try to do that with Danny in this season, but it's not as exciting as they think it is.
No.
Truly.
I did enjoy that whole arc in general.
Yeah.
The one aspect I will say that I didn't mind was getting that kind of vision at the end where we see the Iron Throne and it's completely fucking obliterated and ash. Knowing where the show ends up in the end maybe didn't quite deliver what was kind of set up.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed that vision and I enjoyed that kind of like potential. But besides that, there were no redeeming qualities.
Yeah, one scene does not make up for an
2.
entire season of bad arc.
Definitely the worst part of season 2, I think.
Yeah,
and
in that same kind of way though, like John's story really does kind of like stagnate a bit like that as well. Like they spend 3 or 4 episodes wandering around the north, kind of doing the same kind of stuff. And they do kind of give a backseat to most of the Night's Watch characters.
But to me, I would say watching John be on the wall is so much more interesting than watching Danny
in this stupid little city.
Yeah, because John's a more likable character in my opinion.
Yeah.
His interactions with like Sam and stuff are really engaging, and the whole dynamic with the Night's Watch, and then learning what's beyond the wall is like a whole mystery within itself, and getting a bit more with like the wildlings and then the White Walker mystery as well. Like even though not a ton was happening in that whole arc, I found it way more engaging than Danny's.
Definitely more engaging, but it is a lot slower. Obviously, season 3 I think is the strongest wildling like arc.
Yeah.
But they do set it up well, and compared to what they do with Danny, they don't set up anything for her here. Like it's just never brought up again, ever.
Felt like a bit of a waste of time.
Literally.
And then I guess one final aspect for me that season 1 and 2 struggle with is the action scenes. Like a lot of the sword fight scenes in season 1 and 2.
Yeah.
They're not overly well choreographed.
They're a bit clunky.
Yeah, they're a bit rough around the edges. I don't mind it personally because I'm definitely more of like a story character guy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need good action to be entertained. You get so few of them in season 1 and 2, and the ones that you do get, they're very brief. They're a bit rough. They're not overly well choreographed, and they kind of end a bit prematurely as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like the one with Ned and Jamie, for example. Like they definitely fix that in future seasons, and I think part of the reason why they might have struggled a bit was probably like that budget restraint that we talked about earlier.
Budgetary concerns for doing that kind of stuff, but yeah, I don't know, I didn't mind it as much. Like they could have done a bit more at a few different points, had a bit more action to bring you in, but I really don't think that was the point of the first few seasons. And obviously where they are able to do it with more budget later on, it's just not as interesting sometimes. You watch it and you're like, yeah, okay, cool. And it's kind of like, it wasn't really necessary in the first seasons anyway, so I agree and disagree with that.
Okay, so moving on, let's talk about our favourite characters.
Okay.
Specifically looking at just season 1 and 2. So the first 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, so many characters are introduced. For you, who is your favourite character?
I'd probably have to say Robb Stark. So he's the eldest Stark child, you know, and he really, especially at the end of season 1 after Ned dies, he takes such a big like step up. You know, King in the North, first King in the North for generations. It's a cool kind of like viewpoint character. I've always kind of felt like a special affinity with the Starks. I don't know, like they were like my favourite house when I was watching it growing up. And obviously stuff happens later with them, but I always really cared about their journey and their story. But Robb just felt really cool, you know, like he's
very charismatic.
Yeah, he's a charismatic leader, and he's a really gifted general, and it's not really tested or proven or shown that much early on, but he does so successfully, and the entire North, this place that you're brought into the world of Westeros with, kind of supports him and backs him, and you really feel for him and his story. And there's that bit, I think, in season 1 or 2, no, it is in season 1, when he finds out that his dad was killed, and he's just destroying his sword on a tree in that forest, and he's just emotional.
Fucking hypes you up.
Yeah, and Catelyn comes out. You really get invested with his story. You want him and his rebellion to succeed. You want to see him as King of the North.
Absolutely.
It's one of the best bits. He has a lot of beautiful scenes. He has a lot of emotional scenes, and I think he brings a lot to the show. Robb stuff and all of the Northern Rebellion was some of my favourite parts of the first few seasons. Yeah,
he really shines in season 2, I think. Like season 1, he's kind of set up, not really an overly important character, but then season 2 he really steps up and takes the reins as one of the series protagonists.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, for me, my favourite character, look, it's very hard to kind of pick one character from season 1 and 2 because there are so many characters, and there's a bit of an overlap as well, like with what characters get good and then what happens in future seasons as well. But one character that is a real standout to me is actually Arya Stark. So in the same vein of with Rob, the Starks are obviously like the coolest family. They have the most likable characters, and Arya, for me in particular in season 1 and 2, she's a real standout for me in terms of being like a bit of a wild child, right? She's a tomboy. She doesn't really fit in. I really like in the pilot how she's established as being like a better kind of warrior than Bran is, by running in and hitting like a bullseye. And I really like that aspect. And then her relationship with Jon, and even though it's very short on screen, they managed to eke so much out of that because there's a very big like overlap and mutual understanding where these two characters, like she's a woman who doesn't really fit in, and he is, you know, a bastard that doesn't really fit in. I like that kind of dichotomy between those two characters, and then how she gets that sword from Jon, which is Needle, which is such a cool moment, and then her going to King's Landing and getting trained with the sword fighting as well. And I really like how Ned embraces that side of her. He doesn't try and get her to change and be like Sansa. No, he lets her be the person that she is.
He wants her to be able to protect herself, and if she wants to like learn sword fighting and archery, he's like, go for it.
And I think Dany kind of gets propelled into this like feminist icon a fair bit, particularly later on in the show as well. And I honestly think Arya is a better female character than her because she's a real standout about not conforming to the social norms and stuff. And I like she fakes being a boy in season 2. I really like her arc in season 2. She's fucking basically thrown to the wolves. Like, she's only a really young kid. She's younger than Sansa, and she's thrown into a really tough situation. Her father's just been murdered in front of her. The whole city's out to try and kill her, and she has to fucking fend for herself, and she does so. I really enjoy that, and like we mentioned, like those scenes with Tywin Lannister are peak. And I really like how season 2 kind of sets her up as well for what's to come in the future seasons. She's a really engaging character for me. But let's talk about some honorable mentions as well, because we can't just pick a character each. It's just insane.
There's too many.
Honorable mention for yourself.
Look, there's a lot of characters that are awesome. Tyrion's obviously fantastic. Tywin is set up really well in season 1 and 2, and obviously those scenes with Arya are really cool. But one of my probably favourite characters, if we're just looking at the first 2 seasons, maybe Peter Baelish, Littlefinger.
Chaos is a ladder.
Chaos is a ladder. I don't know. He's got a lot of charisma as this creepy little dude. You know, he's dressed really well. He's built his own house. He's built his name for himself, and he's super cunning. He's willing to do whatever it takes. Him and Varys are probably the best players in the Game of Thrones. You know, like they are little spiders, little creatures. They control everything from the shadows, and they have their fingers in so many pockets all over the city. It's really interesting to see how he works, and I don't particularly love him as like a moral character. Obviously, he betrays Ned in season 1.
Yeah, he's not a likable character, but he's a very entertaining, engaging character.
Every time he's on screen, I'm super invested in what he's doing,
and it's respectable too, because he didn't come from anything. He built everything himself, and I really like how every decision he makes is for his own benefit, and it actually ends up working out like time and time again throughout the series. Like, every decision he makes, he seems to be one step ahead of everyone else, and that's what makes him such a engaging and cunning character.
Obviously, we see him later on as well, like with various moments controlling things from the shadows. But in season 1 and 2,
that's where he shines.
They set him up for that and all of that kind of stuff. He does get a little bit shafted later on, but he's really strong in that political intrigue and that King's Landing plotline in season 1 and 2.
And like you said, Tyrion is another real standout for me, but one character I just want to give a special shout out as an honourable mention to is Joffrey. So, look, Game of Thrones has a lot of good villains, right? There's a shit ton of them. Joffrey, for me, is so fucking vile and despicable. And, like, after right from the get-go, he's established as being, like, such a dislikable character.
He makes your fucking blood boil.
And no one reins him in. And he's such a believable character, too. Like, he's such a spoiled little brat, but you can believe it. He really believes he is, like, a fucking top dog, and he's not. And I love the couple of times Tyrion puts him in his place, or his slaps are beautiful. But he is a fucking sadist. We get that a little bit later on as well, but, like, the stuff he does to Sansa, like, poor Sansa, he's very, very vile. I mean, mean, I think the stuff with Rose is also introduced in season 2. The prostitute.
I think that's season 2, yeah.
Yeah, and he is such a dislikable character, and for that's what makes him like so engaging. I love the way he sits on that throne. The way that like his posture, his demeanor, you just fucking want to strangle him. And he's really, really like, him being such a dislikable character makes all the characters who oppose him more likable.
Yeah, true. Like him just simply existing and being the way he is props up everyone else, including the people who stand up to him, like Tyrion, Cersei at times, and Tywin when he comes in a bit later.
Yeah, I love how even fucking Tywin struggles to rein him in season 2 and season 3 as well. But
any man that has to say I am the king is no true king. Beautiful.
Absolutely. Let's move on. Favorite episode of season 1 and 2. So the first
both
quarter.
Seasons. I'd probably have to say in season 1, episode 7, You Win or You Die.
Yeah, that's a fantastic episode.
It's such a good episode. It obviously sucks for what it sets up, for what happens for our lead character, but
so much goes on.
The Game of Thrones, the actual kind of like setup of everything that goes on, the most payoff we ever see is in this episode.
Yeah.
We get Robert Baratheon dying. So we see him getting injured. We know that he's going to die, and they have to set up everything that's coming afterwards. We get everything with Ned.
And we know there's going to be big fucking repercussions from this. Like, we can sense it.
Everyone,
everything's building to this moment.
Everything's tense. The whole episode. Everyone wants a piece of the pie. It's mentioned multiple times. Renly's trying to get stuff. Ned's trying to get stuff. Littlefinger's trying to set stuff up with Ned. Robert's trying to set things up just before he dies. There's beautiful dialogue moments, and the tension that you feel towards the end of the episode, and that shock of Littlefinger betraying Ned. Ned goes into that fucking throne room thinking, I've got this writ from the king. It is signed. I've got the City Watch, the gold cloaks on my side because Littlefinger has set me up. I'm good. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to do my duty and do what I have to do.
Yep.
I never expected it to go that poorly. And then for what it sets up later for the rest of the season, it also has that one scene with Cersei and Ned where they talk about the Game of Thrones specifically. They do name drop the title.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah.
They talk about the whole theme of the show. Beautiful scene.
But it is well done. You know, it's not like cheesy where they talk about it like that. They talk about it. It sets up the whole premise of the entire show.
Foreshadows what happens as well.
Exactly. And it's a really beautiful moment. I think it's the quintessential Game of Thrones moment for the whole season 1.
Yeah, it's definitely like it and Baylor are the two standout episodes of season 1, and they're both incredible. And also to throw in like the whole Jorah saving Dany incident as well.
Yeah.
And then how you have Drogo fucking declare war on the Seven Kingdoms, and
how
much like so much happens that it's kind of like this was the bust episode.
Yeah.
And then the episode 8, 9 and 10 are kind of just like the following aftershocks of this episode.
All these decisions that happened in this episode.
Yeah. I think it's one of the elite episodes of season 1 for sure. I mean, season 1's like a very consistent season.
Yeah.
Like, there really aren't any bad episodes. They're all probably like a 7 out of 10 or better. And that episode is absolutely a standout.
At minimum, you know?
But for me, look, a lot of people rate this episode to be among the best of Game of Thrones. And for me, that's season 2, episode 9, Blackwater. So we've been saving this one. We didn't talk about it much when we were discussing season 2 because it deserves the limelight, because Blackwater is honestly the episode that kind of saved Game of Thrones, I think. Up until this point, lots of setup was happening. There wasn't much payoff. This is our payoff episode. Mm-hmm. Like episode 9 is throughout all of Game of Thrones. It's an ensemble show, right? We cut between different locations, different characters so much. Blackwater gives us an episode, for the first time in the entire series, gives us an episode where we focus on one location. And we focus on one event.
Yeah.
And we focus on one character.
One set of characters.
Tyrion takes the fucking lead, and my god does he fucking revel in it. He is incredible in this episode as the protagonist. There's so much going on here. All of season 2 is building up to this, right? We have the whole Stannis build up as well, and when is he going to make his move? We have Tyrion discovering like the wildfire and how he's going to use that. We have all of the fucking shenanigans going on in King's Landing, right? And all of that can be for nothing if King's Landing gets fucking taken, because there's serious repercussions here. We have Joffrey and all of the fucking vile shit he's done in season 2. Seeing him be thrown into like a position where he's the king defending his city, and what ends up happening there. We have Cersei and how she's kind of in this area with all of the women and children with Sansa, and then she ends up leaving, and this
fucking drinking, making them feel like shit.
Yeah, there's so much going on. The Hound as well as a standout episode for him.
Yeah, true.
So this is the first big dog episode of the entire series. It's the highest budget episode to date. The Battle of Blackwater is stunning visually.
It's a spectacle, truly. I haven't seen anything quite as impressive, especially not in the entire Game of Thrones before this moment.
No, this was the moment where everyone's like stood up and they're like, holy fuck, Game of Thrones can do action.
It's jaw dropping.
Yeah.
You know, you get chills, you get goosebumps. There's a lot of moments like that throughout this episode, from Tyrion specifically, but that initial like shot of the wildfire over the boats is beautiful.
It's horrific as well. Yeah. And I think what makes this episode to me like so interesting is because Stannis is a character. I might not be fully on board with him, but Stannis and Davos as well, they're characters where we should be rooting for, because we're anti-Joffrey, right? Joffrey is the number one antagonist of the series. They're trying to take over King's Landing and kill Joffrey. So technically we should be rooting for them. But then Joffrey isn't actually the one defending the siege. It's Tyrion, who's a character who we arguably care for the most. He's one of the most sympathetic and likable characters in the entire show, and he's actually the one as Hand of the King who takes over the catalyst of trying to defend this siege on King's Landing.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting dichotomy, because so much, particularly in fantasy, we have these big battles and it's good guys versus bad guys. Who's the good guy here? Who's the bad guy here? I mean, there's good and bad people on both sides, right? So we're kind of, as a audience, we're definitely rooting for Tyrion, but we're also kind of a neutral, right? Like if Tyrion loses and Joffrey gets killed, are we really going to be that mad?
Yeah.
Probably not. Well, obviously not pro Stannis either, but it's a really interesting dichotomy, because it's not just like Lannisters versus Starks, where there's an obvious good and bad
good
guy.
versus bad. It's not like Autobots versus Decepticons, you know, where you got clear villains. It's more morally grey than that, and I think that's really important in this kind of ensemble show, where you've got characters on both sides that you care about and hate. You know, like you've got Davos with Stannis, and Davos has been set up as this really likable kind of guy, and you've got Tyrion, obviously, who's leading the charge, and he's really, as much as you want Joffrey to get fucking murdered in this, you also don't want anything bad to happen to Tyrion or your favourite characters on the Lannister side.
And one really, really important thing for me in terms of action is also not neglecting character and story. Mm-hmm. And I think this is why Blackwater is one of my favorite episodes in all of Game of Thrones, is because while we have that action and spectacle, it's matched with extremely rich characterization. We have Joffrey from kind of failing to take that role of king. He abandons his men. Yeah. And at that point it seems like all hope is lost, right? And then Tyrion stepping up and finally getting this moment where he's always kind of just been like, he shies away from responsibility. He's the youngest of the Lannister family, so there's no real ever chance for him to shine prominent, right? Yeah. And he's a dwarf, and that kind of characterization as well. Yeah, he gets this moment where he's an unlikely candidate, where he steps up and leads his men to defend this siege, and it's such a powerful, like that speech that Tyrion gives is one of my favorite fucking scenes in all of Game of Thrones. It's incredible. You know, you get goosebumps, you get excited for him, and he stands super tall during that speech. Yeah, and not only that, he fights on the front lines as well. He's out there. He's through that mud gate. And then we get that dynamic too, where like the Lannisters have fucking hired like someone to make sure that he doesn't survive the battle. He's literally out there like on the front lines defending this fucking city that he doesn't even care for, and there's still someone from his own family trying to make sure that he doesn't survive the battle. He's got threats on both sides. It's insane. Yeah. And then the whole dynamic with like Sir Davos losing his son, and then continuing on, and Stannis making that decision to, you know, after the wildfire hits, the smart decision was to leave. But Melisandre said he would win the battle, so he continues through. You know? He continued through with blind faith, and he fucking paid the price because he ends up losing. There's so many incredible, memorable moments, but for me, one of my favorites is the Hound, where he's trying to rally the troops as well with Tyrion. It's kind of like a two-man army at this point in time, and he says something along the lines of, if I catch any man without blood on their sword, I'll rape your dead corpse. Like, honestly, like one of the best lines from the Hound, and one of many great lines, but it's unlike anything that's been said before. That's for sure. Absolutely. I love that moment for sure. And then he gets a ton of characterization as well, because to this point he's not a character with a ton of depth, right? Like he has these moments sprinkled out, but this is the episode where he really gets a lot of depth, because we see his reaction to the fire, and we fucking feel that, okay, he's got some serious trauma from that. And
we can see it on his face.
We literally get it. Yeah, like his scarred face. We don't know the full story. We know that his brother did it, but like it's not something he's open and talking about to other characters, right? Like so many other characters. It was kind of
spoken about in like very early in season 1. Littlefinger gives his version of events.
Yeah.
We don't know if that's true though, because it's Littlefinger.
And to see him have that moment, and then he's just like, fuck the king, and just throws his sword down and leaves. We obviously have like Cersei getting drunk and saying how fucked we are and how we're all going to get raped. We have Sansa also hiding there as well. A few of the moments as well where they're drinking like before the battles is all fantastic build up. Obviously the climax at the end where they are successful in repelling Stannis' forces through Tywin coming in and saving the day, and then taking all of the credit from Tyrion. Tyrion gets slashed in the head. He wakes up and he's told, oh yeah, you're no longer hand of the king. Gets zero respect, zero credibility for what he did, and Tywin is the hero of Blackwater.
He bears that scar too, you know, like he does everyone, he keeps things going. He's initially successful in defending the city, and then he's out there on the front lines fighting, and it's like, who the fuck was that guy?
Yeah.
You know?
Game of Thrones is at its best when Tyrion is at the helm, I think, and this was the first real episode for that, and it has so many ramifications for both the overall plot, but both his character as well. We get everything about him in that moment where Tywin comes in, his dad comes in and saves the day and takes away all of that credibility.
Kind of sums him up pretty well.
Yeah.
Look, one of the best parts about this episode is it's not clear at any point who is going to win. I think it has a longer runtime than some of the other episodes as well, but what you get is you have beautiful moments where each of them feel like they're winning, you know? The wildfire feels like the Lannisters are doing well. Stannis then continues the assault, storms the beach, and he's winning that fight, and they're getting through the mud gate, and then Joffrey leaves, and then the fight goes poorly, like Lancel gets like hurt, and people are getting killed left, right, and center. Joffrey leaves, they're demoralized. Tyrion gets them back up, then he gets injured on the battlefield. It's so flip-floppy up and down the whole episode. You don't know what's going to happen.
Incredibly structured.
Tense. Very well structured. Very, very good.
For me, I think this episode was perfect because it was the payoff of like 8 episodes of build-up.
It leads up to that.
And it really delivers. Like, to this point, Game of Thrones hadn't had that kind of episode. Yeah. And this delivers. And it sets the fucking bar so incredibly high. And, spoiler, like, future seasons of Game of Thrones actually managed to match that incredibly high bar with their episode 9s and climactic episodes. So now let's move on to our final thoughts and verdict for seasons 1 and 2. If you had to rate just season 1 and 2 isolated from the rest of the series, well, what would you rate season 1 out of 10?
Okay, all right.
100.
Season 1 out of 100?
Yep.
It is one of the best seasons of television that has ever existed.
Absolutely.
You know, it sets things up really, really well. It's unlike anything you've seen before. It's lower budget, but it still has amazing moments, and it's super well written.
Yep.
I think season 1 of Game of Thrones is 90 out of 100.
Yep.
You know, like it's way...
I agree completely. Yeah. I'm on the same thing. I'm hovering between 90 and 95.
Yeah.
I'll probably go safe and undercut it at 90. I don't think people appreciated it enough when they watched it for the first time, but like going back and looking back at it, it is seriously like one of the best episodes of television of all time.
One of the best seasons. It still holds up, you know, like watching it back when it first came out, it hooks you in immediately, and then rewatching it again only a few months ago, the first few seasons, that first season still holds up incredibly well.
Yep. Absolutely. And then what about season 2? Season
2 has a lot of really good moments. It still is quite a strong season of television. It was enjoyable to watch. Of course, like I said, when I first watched Game of Thrones, it was binging those first 2 seasons to get me up to date for season 3 when that was airing.
Yep.
Obviously, Blackwater is one of the best episodes of all time.
Yep.
But it is structured very differently, you know, and there are a lot of arcs in that season that don't completely add up. There's a lot of good moments that we spoke about. There's unfortunately some shittier moments. So I'm going to have to say only 80 for season 2.
Look, I'm in agreement again. Like we've synced up perfectly here with our ratings. Dany's arc,
such a letdown,
is what drags this season down. I think if you extracted Dany's arc from this season and you just looked at everything else, it's probably pretty close to season 1. I think There's so much quality going on here, so much setup that later seasons get the payoff for, and I think you can't really like detract that from the season. You know, it's a setup season that future seasons reap the benefits for. That doesn't mean that it's a boring season because of that. And
not at all.
It does its job perfectly, and I think the way season 2 ends, like it might start off a bit slow, but those last couple of episodes of season 2 are fucking phenomenal.
Yeah,
I think all of the performances are incredible throughout as well. The writing is at its best, I think, in season 2. Like it's so good. You get that dialogue sparring. Danny's arc is a huge downside for me, which is why I could only give it an 80 out of 100. I don't think I could go any higher than that.
They spend too much time on it.
Yeah, it takes up a big chunk of the series, and it's least engaging aspect for me.
If they took it out, if Danny wasn't in season 2, I think it would have been a lot higher. It would have been more succinct as well.
Still, like 2 incredible seasons of television, and if we were averaging them out, I guess we're giving the first quarter of Game of Thrones an 85. Yeah. So
very nice.
I think if we were to give that final rating, we're both sitting at an 85 for the first quarter of Game of Thrones.
Beautiful to be in agreement with you.
It's a rarity, honestly. But yeah, let's wrap it up. So the first quarter of Game of Thrones, it's all about the setup, but the future seasons is where we really get into full swing. Everything gets dialed up more. We get more unique characters. We get higher budgets, more spectacle, a lot more action, and even the stakes get turned up as well. And honestly, like what's to come in seasons 3 and 4 is some of the best television you will ever see. And we're going to save that for another episode of the podcast. So any final thoughts on the first quarter of Game of Thrones?
Seasons 1 and 2, they are not to be undercut by the future seasons at all. They are super strong in their own way, and they're a beautiful entry point to the season. I don't think the rest of Game of Thrones could have existed without the hard work at the low budget and the intelligent craft and writing they put in with the first.
There's so much care that goes into those early seasons, and honestly,
you can feel it.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to watch and really see like writing, character, plot take precedent over spectacle. And I think for me that was when Game of Thrones was really at its best. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this episode of the For the Record podcast. Thank you, Luke, for joining me on this one. If you'd like to subscribe to Luke, his YouTube channel will be listed in the description below, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode for seasons 3 and 4 of Game of Thrones.
Bye, y'all.